Hi, I'm John, and this is a Solid Edge Works Piccolo. It's a bit small of a figure, but I love the pose and it scales perfectly with this little guy. And because of that, I'm going to use it to make his Postboy outfit from a fan favorite filler episode where he borrows Goku's clothes to get his driver's license. First, I have to make some pickle soup. After letting it sit in hot water for a while and struggling for an hour, I was able to pull the figure apart. So now that I did that, let's start with something easy like his torso. First, I cut off all the battle damaged fringes off his shirt since I'm going to be using it as his overshirt. Then I used some Tamiya basic putty to smooth out and cover up all the bumpy areas that I cut, with plans to sand it down later on. Then, starting with the arms, I applied a thin layer of epoxy sculpt to sculpt on his sleeves. I debated cutting down some of the muscles on his arms, but I figured it would be better to let the green man keep the gun show. I kept the layers as thin as possible, but was still able to add some of the folds in his shirt, especially in the bends of the elbows. Moving down to the legs, the end goal was to get him to his 90s skinny jeans, so I started by cutting down the bulk of his legs. I debated creating some legs from scratch, but similar to what I did with Goku, I decided to use what was given to me. After cutting the bulk off to a reasonable level with an X-Acto knife, I decided to bring in the Dremel. A Dremel was great at getting the legs down to the thinnest I can get it, as well as sanding some of the areas down like the belt. I also cut off some of the excess material of his shoes off screen. Moving on to sculpting, I glued the shoes back into his legs and started sculpting on the top of his socks, since it's easier to sculpt the jeans on top of them rather than trying to fit them underneath later on. Then I continued to add a thin layer of epoxy sculpt to his entire legs. I had a much better experience using this product as opposed to Goku after receiving some great advice in the comments of that video, and also knowing what I would use this for based off of that experience, which is the base layer of the pants and some simple folds. I also added in some line markings using a sculpting tool for when I would go back in later for some details. While that cured, I moved all the way back up to the head, where I started by snipping off the antenna and then covering up the holes using some Tamiya basic putty on the off chance that I would see the holes when I sculpt on the hat. While that dried up, I rolled up some noodly bits of some Tamiya epoxy putty to sculpt on his undershirt. I made sure that the undershirt sat only on top of the neck piece so I can easily pop in the neck piece in after I paint it. Moving back up to the hat, I applied a thin layer of Tamiya epoxy putty as a foundation, and then used some small noodly bits of putty to sort of build up the fabric, particularly around the top of the hat to give it a more boxy look. I also put a piece of dried putty on the back of his head as a support for the brim. Once this layer of putty was dry and stable, I went ahead and added in the rest of the cap brim. If I didn't have that support piece here while sculpting, the putty in this section would have definitely flopped over a bit. I also added in a couple more details to the hat, like the little top hat button thing. Secretly, in between sculpting sessions for the hat, I also formed a new collar section for the overshirt since I cut off all the battle damaged bits before, and the added lift of the new sculpt helps sell the idea that there are two shirts here. I also added some noodly bits to the arm to sell the overshirt idea, even though they're secretly the same shirt. Going back to the pants, I used some small noodly bits of Tamiya epoxy putty to help add some of the stitching detail to the jeans on top of the lines I pressed in earlier on. I also took this opportunity to give him his cake back, since I butchered it off earlier with the Dremel. Then continuing down the legs, I added in some more socks to the sculpt after realizing how low the shoes would sit. Speaking of the shoes, I started with the tongue of the sneaker, pressing in a little ball of epoxy putty into the front of the shoe, and then using a sculpting tool to press in the little indents on there to give the appearance of laces. Next was adding in a thin layer across the sides and the back of the feet to create the rest of the shoe. I used a sculpting tool to press in some of the indents for the stitching along the top as well as the soles of the shoes. And last but not least, I added the toe caps. Next, I used some Tamiya basic putty to help cover up some of the rough areas of my sculpt and to help hide the transition between some of the plastic and putty on his shirt. And then I proceeded to sand down the entire figure. While you watch me sand this down, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you're interested in getting started in customizing, everything I'm using in the video will be linked in the description below. If you do purchase anything on Amazon through those links, not just the items listed, it'll help me and the channel out with no additional cost to you. And now back to painting. And now that we're done sanding, as a last touch, I added some Tamiya surface primer on some of the more suspicious areas to help make sure that all the gaps were filled. And with that out of the way, it was time to paint. First, I primed the figure in black using some Vallejo surface primer. Then I started with the eyes using some white with some flow improver, which helps leave it with a smoother finish at the end, even after a bunch of paint applications. Also, to not waste some of the paint I already poured, I took this opportunity to paint in the white parts of the hat. Next, I painted a base coat of light green for his skin on his face and neck, as well as his hands. Then I used some royal purple for the undershirt, starting with the neck and then moving on to his sleeves. Moving down to his jeans, I used blue-green as a base coat. I ended up pouring out a little bit too much paint, so I decided to add some highlights by dry brushing on a layer of a mix of blue-green, white, and azure. Next to painting his shoes, I started by painting in several layers of white on the laces, caps, and the soles. Then with some flat blue, I painted in a base layer for the rest of the sneakers. Next, I used some yellow ochre to paint in his socks. Next, I painted in his overshirt using several coats of a mix of yellow ochre and Cork Brown. Before painting in the rest of the hat, I wanted to dry brush some of the lighter tones of his face because even my smallest dry brush is a little big and I didn't want to mess up the paint on the hat. So I took a mix of light green and lemon yellow to add some highlights particularly across the eyebrows, ears, nose, neck, and chest muscles. I also went ahead and did the same thing on his hands, really focusing on the knuckles and the other exposed areas of the hand to give the illusion of extra shadows. Finally, to finish off the hands here, I gave Piccolo a manicure and painted his nails white. With the skin all set and done, I went back to painting the hat. I started with painting a base coat of flat blue for the majority of the hat, and then painted the cap's brim with some flat red. Next, it was time to add some highlights to his shirt. So using some yellow ochre, lemon yellow, and some white, I dry brushed a layer on both the main body of his shirt as well as the sleeves. Then for the purple undershirt, I painted on some highlights using some purple. To finish off adding highlights, I added some flat blue with some white and dry brushed his hat and his sneakers. Moving on to some of the finer details, I started by painting on his eyes using some black paint and a ball stylus. Next was finally time to write on the letters onto his clothing. I was dreading this a bit since I wasn't sure how well I can write using a paintbrush. I mixed some flat red and some flow improver together to start writing the letters on the back of his cap. I figured that if it didn't work out here, at least it wouldn't be visible from the front. The flow improver really helps paint fine lines, but doesn't really help my crappy penmanship. You can see me struggling here, holding it about 2 feet away from me, but the best solution was to fix it off screen by staring at it from about 6 inches from my face instead. With that out of the way, I started writing the infamous POSTBOY on his shirt using some flat blue and some flow improver. I started with the T in the middle to make sure I had equal kerning as I moved outwards. But again, the lettering I did on screen came out a little bit funky while holding it far from my face, but I was able to make some adjustments off screen. Moving on to the home stretch, I used some black wash on some of the deeper crevices to add some extra shading along the stitching of his pants, the folds in his clothing, and the lines and muscle crevices on his face and neck. Then I used some Tamiya X20 thinner to clean up some of the line work, especially along his eyes where some of the black wash got in on the whites of his eyes. All I had to do was put it back together, and that was it. Here's how it looked before. And here's the final product. This was a fun one to make. It took me a long time, but definitely not as long as it took me to make Goku. It was my first attempt at writing letters on a figure, and gave me another chance to work on my sculpting skills, both of which I hope to keep improving. But in the end, I was happy that I have a counterpart to Goku now, and they'll fit really nicely together in my display. Let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, special thanks to my Buy Me a Coffee members. If you want to check out my membership for some behind the scenes photos, videos, and member only polls, please check the video description for my page on buymeacoffee.com. Again, I have everything that I use in the description below, including all the paint colors and paint brushes that I use as Amazon affiliate links. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you're interested in getting started in customizing your own figures, feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and I'll try my best to help. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.